Charlie Kirk was not a saint. He said 2 years ago, it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so we can have the Second Amendment.
Well, this is pretty damn surprising. On the very last episode of his 13-year program, which ends today, Fox News host Howard Kurtz said on air that political violence and extremism exists on both sides, and in response to the brutal assassination of Charlie Kirk, admitted that Kirk, quote, was not a saint, which in turn has triggered MAGA Republicans all across the internet. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. This was a bold editorial decision by Fox News host Howard Kurtz, whose final episode of Media Buzz ends today. He will remain at Fox News, or at least was supposed to remain at Fox News for a few years. He might get fired over this. He was surprisingly blunt and even-handed about this. Check it out.
Politicizing this by blaming the left or liberal lunatics for the actions of someone who's obviously insane. But do you think the media, some in the media, are politicizing this by blaming the left or liberal lunatics for the actions of someone who's obviously insane?
No, I don't think so. I think all available evidence related to the suspect suggests that this was a person who was radicalized by a leftist ideology, every piece of evidence that authorities have released. If the media is going to have an honest conversation about radicalization, where it's happening, how it's happening, and who it's happening to, it has to be acknowledged that extremism isn't necessarily evenly distributed across the political spectrum, and that the left does have a radicalization problem.
Want to focus there because his guest, who is a conservative contributor to the Washington Examiner, which itself is a conservative publication, I want you to listen to what she says. She says that it's not evenly distributed. I'm not sure if she means the violence itself or the media scrutiny of that violence. Pay close attention because we will also address that in addition to what Howard Kurtz has to say.
Does have a radicalization problem that has not been spoken about proportionally in the media as the extremism on the right, and it does exist. There is violent extremism on both sides. It is not proportionate. And in order to have an honest conversation about what led to this moment, that has to focus in part on the left.
I'm glad you mentioned that it's not unique to one side or one party. Charlie.
So let's stop right there because, again, he's going to get... I was stunned when I saw this because I was like, ooh... I mean, it's true what he said and what he's about to say, but given that Charlie Kirk just was assassinated, I'm surprised a Fox News host is going to say this, but just to address this point. So again, I'm not quite sure. At first she seemed to imply that the violence is not proportionate. Like she seemed to imply, at least initially, that left-wing violence was more prevalent, was more proportionate, or was disproportionately greater than that on the right, which is not true. We'll get into that. But then she said, a coverage of left-wing violence doesn't seem to be proportionate. Well, it might be because left-wing violence is just less frequent and generally less egregious. But either way, I just want to say for the record, I don't have a problem at all. I agree with her that it's 100% honest. We need to be honest. If Charlie Kirk's assassin was politically motivated, then that does need to be discussed, just like the political motivation of any assassin or any act of violence needs to be discussed, which means Fox also has to discuss when acts of right-wing political violence occur, and they need to identify that it is because of right-wing ideology, right? We need to be candid, and it has to be universal across the board. So with that in mind, here's what Charlie Kirk said that really pissed MAGA off.
Charlie Kirk was not a saint. He said 2 years ago, it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so we can have the Second Amendment. But his murder makes us feel like a very dangerous time.
So everything else after this is Charles Gasparino, who seems like a relatively nice guy. He's usually involved in the financial analysis on Fox News. I'm not particularly concerned with what he has to say here, but there you have Howard Kurtz admitting that, right now the instinct is to either avoid giving any characterization about Charlie Kirk's beliefs or to lionize and beatify him, sanctify him. That's an impulse, by the way, that we see everywhere, usually when we deal with tragedy, death, murder, things of that nature. The instinct is, by a large swath of people, is to, you don't speak ill of the dead, right? So then people take that impulse, don't speak ill of the dead, and in many cases say, oh, you can only say nice things about the dead. You have to spin it in a positive way. Now, I've tried to be consistent. I didn't like Charlie Kirk. I did not like Charlie Kirk's worldview, and I'm not going to pretend that I did. I'm not going to pretend that he was a moderate. I don't think he was moderate. He was moderate, I think, in temperament, right? He wasn't like a frothing at the mouth lunatic like Vinny from Patrick Bet David, but I think he had generally terrible worldviews, particularly when it came to like civil politics and, electoral politics. He was an election denier, for example. He said he was a free speech warrior, but, he co-signed pretty much everything Donald Trump did in this past 6 weeks with respect to his authoritarian crackdown on free speech, attacking law firms, suing media companies, having his FCC attack media companies. Charlie Kirk enthusiastically supported that, and Kirk also betrayed his own principles very often. So, for example, he was really big about the Epstein files, wanted the Epstein files released, and then when Trump did his 180, Charlie Kirk bent over backwards. There were sometimes he let it slip that he didn't like this, but he even said at one point, he was like, I got to trust my buddies in government and the Trump administration, and I'm not going to talk about that anymore. You're violating your own principles here, and I'm just not going to pretend that's going to happen. But I'm also not a MAGA Fox News host. I guess not that Howard Kurtz is a MAGA Fox News host per se, but he is a Fox News host, and he has to know where his bread is buttered. And when he was speaking during this episode and announcing that that was the last episode of Media Buzz, and which had been announced a couple of weeks ago, that, I'm going to stick around. I'll still be working here, and here at Fox News. I'll still be doing this. That may not happen as a consequence of this. I imagine he's going to catch a lot of shit about it. So if you look at Kurtz, Kirk, Saint, people are happy. Nick's unhappy. Nick Sortor says, what the fuck? Howard Kurtz just backed up those who blame Charlie Kirk for his own killing, bringing up Kirk's stance on the Second Amendment as a contributing factor. Charlie was not a saint. Luckily, Fox has canceled Howard's show, and this was his final episode. Goodbye, but he's going to stay on Fox News. I could not be happier this pathetic, weak little man show got canceled. Just this guy, which I'm convinced this guy's a bot. He's just too omnipresent. I think Paul A. Sizpula, I think that's a bot account. Kurtz is implying that Charlie is in part responsible for what happened to him. This is disgusting. Johnny MAGA, WTF. Fox News' Howard Kurtz says political violence is not unique to one side or party, then feeds into the disgusting leftist narrative that Charlie Kirk's anti-gun control stance was somehow a contributing factor to his assassination. Miranda Devine, who is this right-wing lunatic at the New York Post. Charlie Kirk was not a saint. Howard Kurtz, you need to do better research. Are you saying he was a saint? It's kind of weird. So they're pissed, guys. They're pissed. And I imagine this is not going to do him any favors. He's probably going to be off camera for a while. And if his show weren't getting canceled already, it was definitely going to be canceled after this. But again, I mean, despite the fact that Charlie Kirk's opinions, in my opinion, were terrible, again, the great thing about the United States is one of the great things about the United States is you're not supposed to have to worry about your safety or life while espousing even just bad views. Charlie Kirk did not deserve what happened to him, and it should not have happened. That's why we have to condemn political violence. But I also want to circle back to kind of what was said at the beginning by his guest, which is, what about the distribution of right-wing violence? Well, again, as Mehdi Hassan points out, even Elon Musk's own right-wing grok says based on FBI and DHS reports, 2020 to 2025, domestic terrorism incidents and fatalities are predominantly linked to right-wing ideologies, such as racially motivated or anti-government extremism, e.g. 329 deaths versus 23 from far left per CSIS and START data. Left-wing violence, like some Antifa actions, occurs but is less frequent per these metrics. Critics note potential biases in classification, undercounting left-leaning events like riots. Overall, right-wing sources appear more prevalent in verified stats. If you even look on Twitter, I mean, just people are saying this everywhere, where, again, the data show pretty overwhelmingly in study after study after study, both funded by the government and by think tanks and by universities. So just from every vector, right-wing violence is indeed more prevalent and more egregious. So it tends to result in more fatalities rather than just injuries, and it's just more common in general with respect to political violence. Now, again, it doesn't mean that left-wing violence doesn't exist, and it's very, very possible that Charlie Kirk's assassination was motivated by left-wing violence and left-wing ideological violence. Utah Governor Spencer Cox has been making the rounds on the interview shows today saying that that is exactly what motivated it and that more evidence will be produced when charges are brought on Tuesday. I'm waiting until that documentation comes out, but as I said from the beginning, it's entirely possible. It still doesn't change the fact that it's still more prevalent on the right than the left, and we don't have to pretend otherwise. But there you have it, folks. That was an unexpectedly blunt thing to say from a Fox News host on air, but it could be where he's like, fuck it, I'm canceled already. They're taking my show off air. I might as well just say the truth as I see it, no matter who it pisses off. And it'll be interesting to see what this just happened a couple of hours ago, what the reaction is from MAGA in the incoming days. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.